We are now in the 5th week of the testing cycle on PTR, and in this video, I just want to walk through a couple of the changes that hits in this latest build. They hit yesterday at the time of this recording. I wanted to spend some time getting into the dungeons though and testing out a few of the changes that they did there. So that's what I'm going to be kind of showing off in this video, but I do want to quickly talk about tank changes first. We are really winding down on the tank changes that Blizzard are making. Instead of seeing these like crazy overarching multiple buffs or nerfs or changes to classes, we're starting to see like the fine tuning knobs come in. And I think that's a good indicator that we are reaching the end of the PTR cycle and that Blizzard is kind of finally honing in that balance on the classes. So in the near future, I will be eventually kind of giving the rankings of the tank and going over everything that's changing. But in this video, let's go over these notes. So Blood Death Knight, for like the 5th week in a row now, has seen like basically no changes. Death Knight isn't in a bad spot though. I find that Blood DK is fairly enjoyable to play. It's still currently suffering from like really hefty early on damage, and in the highest level of keys, it seems like their runic power, or at least their resource economy, is more or less capping out, but they are bringing great utility this season. And when you aren't scaled to a flat item level in these keys, I'm assuming once you're like late game in this next patch, Blood DK is going to feel pretty good. One of the bigger changes that we're seeing is actually on the Demon Hunter. Now, they did change some interactions with Vengeful Retreat and Fellblade. I think this more or less affects Havoc. I don't feel like this is actually really affecting Vengeance all that much. And they did make some adjustments to Fellscarred. Some for Havoc, some for Vengeance, and then we also saw some talent changes as well. So Student of Suffering mastery values being reduced. This doesn't really affect Vengeance at all, so we're just going to jump right down here. So Fallout soul generation is actually being increased in lower target counts. I haven't tested VDH since these notes have been out and in like this current PTR build, but this is really nice. Fallout is this really weird ability where when you cast Immolation Aura, it has a chance to shatter these lesser soul fragments from your enemies. In larger Mythic plus dungeon pulls, this feels really good because basically you Immolation Aura into a Spirit Bomb, or you Immo into basically Fragment Cap. So in lower targets though, it felt more or less RNG or inconsistent, so essentially they're trying to make it more consistent, which is again thumbs up. Feed the Demon was now reduced to a 1-point node. It was a 2-point node. This is good because it gives you now easier access to Last Resort, which is Demon Hunter's cheat death. Mostly they've kind of been running without it for a lot of this season. Now, you don't necessarily need it for most content. It's really good in progression content, whether it's like progression mythic grade, or it's really good in basically like progression type keys until you feel comfortable, or it can be used as a defensive to get basically an extra meta use. So them reducing this to a 1-point node just eases up access in kind of the tier 3 of our tree. Feed the Demon though, it like at a 2-point, it received a nerf, but at a 1-point, it received a buff. So they kind of found this middle ground between 0.25 and 0.5 seconds per soul fragment consumed. Now, generally speaking, you are going to be consuming 2 soul fragments every time you cast, whether it's Soul Cleave or more if you cast Spirit Bomb. So generally, you're going to be getting a reduction of like 0.7 seconds every time you cast one of your kind of spenders. I would take this though any day over a 2-point node. I really don't like 2-point nodes. That's kind of one big gripe I have with any class tree is 2-point nodes generally feel bad, and they feel like they're really there to block pathing like early on. I don't know, they just feel bad. Anyways, the last couple changes we're seeing is a nerf to Demon Surge. Now, last week we saw a 40% buff to this damage, so reducing it by 20 is kind of just walking back that change a little bit. Burning Blades was also nerfed just by a little bit, which I believe is just the damage of your abilities being applied to the target, so a little bit of an offensive nerf for the Demon Hunter. And then there was an issue with Feldev not sharing a cooldown. But outside of that, looking pretty good. Vengeance is kind of falling in a pretty good spot. A lot of people are saying that Vengeance is looking like one of the better tanks this season. We'll have to see. I'm always cautious on trying to predict anything before we even have a launch date or a release date for this patch, but nonetheless, it is looking like a good tank. Now, we got no mention of Monk at all, no mention of Prop Paladin, and no mention of Guardian Druid. So basically, most of the tanks have just been ignored in this set of notes. Protection did see some changes, but these were changes that were announced earlier in the week. I'm not going to go through this entire developer note, but basically, they said, we're happy with the pacing of Warrior, but we feel like we overdid it because there's an issue in single targets where your rotation is basically dead, which is what most warriors have been saying. So they're walking back the Devastator and Strategist nerf by about 50%. So on live servers currently, it's a 30% chance to reset. They nerfed it to 20 with their kind of philosophy shift of how warrior should be playing. And now they're walking it back from 20 to 25. So they're walking it back half. Now, I will say that this is the tank that I tested in these keys that I've been kind of maybe showing and sprinkling in this video, or maybe you'll see when I'm talking about the dungeon changes. But Prot Warrior feels really good now. You're not necessarily rage cap. You're not overflowing with resources, but you're also not starved. And my biggest complaint, and what I've been very vocal about in my last couple of videos where I've talked about Warrior, is that single target feels bad. AoE feels good, single target feels bad. This actually made single target feel good. I think 25% is a really good number to land on. There might be like 1 or 2 moments over the course of both of the keys that I tested where I felt like, oh man, I have a dead global here. I don't have rage, I don't have cooldowns, and there's literally nothing for me to hit. I don't have Thunderclap, I don't have Shield Slam, I didn't get a reset on my last auto or my Thunderclap. Like, basically there's very, very, very few moments where you're sitting there, which is, I think, how a class should play. It's healthy. On top of that, the rage in both AoE and single target feels good. You have some decision making between, do I want to spend rage on revenge or execute if the boss is low enough, or do I want to make sure I'm dumping into ignore pain? But you never feel like you have to, you're starved basically, which is good. I think that's kind of their intended goal. I think Blizzard's really falling in a good spot here. So I've been happy with Warrior in the 2 keys that I tested. It also has a really fun playstyle cadence. Plus, I've been playing Colossus, which is always a blast in keys when you get really big demolish hits. Anyways, the last 2 little changes they made is they reduced punish. I'm assuming this is because you're now getting more procs of Shield Slam. Therefore, you can stack this up to its max cap. So this is about a 25% nerf that we're seeing. It's now a 9% total damage reduction over 12. But again, Warrior's so tanky right now. You're not going to notice this, and you'll probably still play through punish if you need to. It also opens up some agency to like move into the other side of the tree if you'd like. And then this is actually a pretty good change, and it makes weak aura or even non-weak aura players have an easier time tracking ignore pain. It's now going to display the percent in stacks compared to Aegis maximum absorb amount. So if you're staring at your buff tracker, it'll show like a number like 37, which means that you have 30% of the absorb value remaining, because there is a cap to how much ignore pain you can actually have on. So if you're paying attention to this, you can start really min-maxing your rage and knowing like, oh, I'm ignore pain capped right now, so the rage that I have in excess, I can now spend on revenge or execute, or shield block, which you should be using anyways. Anyways, really good Prot Warrior changes in my opinion. VDH, I don't really care for, if I'm being honest right now. They're trying to find that middle ground for it to, like, a good landing place for it. Anyways, let's move over to dungeon changes. So just in case you aren't familiar with how PTR has been working, basically they rotate each week's the dungeon pool that's available for testing. And this is mostly to prevent players from just like focusing on one dungeon and making sure that they get like a good breadth of data. So the first week we were only able to test Floodgate, and then they kind of rotated back and forth. So then the next week it was the War Within dungeons, and then they went to Legacy dungeons. And then last week, which was week 4, they did Operation Floodgate plus all of the War Within dungeons again, and they made changes appropriately based on earlier weeks of testing. And now this week, they have retired the War Within dungeons. They're keeping Floodgate, but they're also letting us test the Legacy dungeons for now the second time. And so a lot of these changes were based on feedback and or data that they have, I'm assuming, to address some of the issues. And I think these are all really good changes, so I'm going to walk through them one by one. I'll try to show footage the best I can, but we'll see. So the number of battle mines on the Tussle Tonks actually has been reduced significantly, making the arena a lot less hectic to move around and navigate, which is great. I didn't have a problem as a tank with this, but I saw my groups I was playing with struggle with how many mines were spawning, and maybe I'll try to get some footage when I'm not wall POV on this fight. But the fight's crazy. Anyways, the periodic ground pound in the Tussle Tonks encounter has been reduced to 2 seconds, was 3. I don't know. Okay, I genuinely don't know what this means, because when I read this, I thought it was a nerf. But then I was like, wait, did they buff it that it now, instead of ticking every 3 seconds, it ticks every 2? Or is this the total cast time? So maybe now because the cast time is shorter, it's going to tick faster. But when I was comparing the footage side by side, it looked like it was doing the same amount of ticks over the same amount of time, but it's hard to tell without doing an actual side-by-side, which I'll try to do in this video. But basically, I don't know if this was actually implemented or not, or if it's like bugged still. It doesn't matter. The fight, I think, is still a little too hectic, but again, this is a good change. Now, some of the trash changes that they're seeing is the corrosive gunks now targets players less. I think this is the debuff that goes on the tank specifically, or whoever has threat, which is fine. The corrosive gunk can also be spell reflected, and it can be disease dispelled, which you definitely want to do in this dungeon because it makes your tank have 15% less attack or haste and 10% less attack speed or something like that. They also changed the Mechagon Tinkerer's anti-personal squirrel. This can no longer be used as a mind control target. So basically, priests, what they were doing is they were going in, mind controlling the mob, and when they used the squirrel on enemy mobs, it would deal like millions of damage. This was tech that was used back in BFA. It was used in Dragonflight, and now it would be used, or Shadowlands? Yeah, Shadowlands. And then now it would be used again in this expansion, but luckily they have removed it, so the priest meta is no longer going to exist, which is great. Now, one change that I'm not a big fan of is they adjusted the spawning of the final trash pack in the instance. So beforehand, in the old Mechagon, you were able to basically lock gate skip or death skip or meld skip past the final trash pack because it's extremely lethal. There was like double defense bot. There was a couple Tinkerers, and there's also like the Machinists or whatever they are. And it was just a lethal pack, and it generally would put you over %. So a lot of groups would opt to try to skip this because it was just the hardest trash pull in the dungeon. What they've done is they've split it up, but they put a pack at the very, very top. So if you try to lock gate skip, you'll have to deal with 1 defender and 2 defense bots. Now this pack actually isn't that bad because you can use the defender's shield. So as long as you focus down the defense bots, it's generally going to be fine. The only thing that I don't like about this is it forces you kind of to go over trash, like your trash count, because in Cujo's room, you want to try to clear it out as much as possible because the last thing you want is to pull an extra dog in. But if you try to clear most of that room, even if you skip one of the drills, you're still going to be over at this point if you're holding W by like 4, 5, 6%. So I'm not a huge fan of this change, but that's only because I generally will play with warlocks or classes that can skip that last trash pack. Anyways, the last kind of thing that they changed was the Machinist Garden. They have made the self-trimming hedge. They despawn kind of quicker, so there's never going to be like 9 or 10 blades in the room. There's going to be like a max 6. And they have added like a little bit of a kind of swirl animation like around the blade itself, so it's a little bit more visible because there's like texture to it now. One of the problems before was that it was just hard to see because it was like a very stale, bland object moving on like a brown floor, so it was just difficult to see. And then lastly, I guess King Mechagon's Mega Zap has been reduced. This is a really good change. It was starting to one-shot people even in like 10s and 12s, so I'm happy with this change. The Motherlode, I didn't test this one yet, but basically they only really changed the last boss. They updated his visual. I don't know what that looks like. Maybe there's some other critter with footage, or I'll eventually get around to testing it. But for now, they've just made it easier to tell where the indicator is. And then they've also increased the cadence of cooldowns, or decreased the cadence of cooldowns, so you have more time to actually do stuff. The fight in the first week of testing was like not chaotic because it's not a lot going on, but it's like it's Gatling gun into swirls into homing missile, and then it would go back into Gatling gun again, and it was just like you never had time if you were a range player to like sit and do damage. So I'm assuming this is going to be a good change. And then they also reduce his health a little bit. This doesn't surprise me. He felt very beefy in like the 10s and 12s that I tested last week, or 2 weeks ago now at this point. They also reduced the area denial in Rixa Flux Flame's room. The Azerite Catalyst plus all of the other Azerite that was just in the room, it basically made you have like no ground space, which made the fight really one-dimensional and stale, which I was not a fan of. Because you just like were forced to move to one little spot, and then the propellant blast wasn't creative because you basically had to clear the entire room because you had no room to work with. I think this is fine. Again, I have to get in there and test. And then last but not least, they increased the cooldown of the War Machine deploying crawler mines at the end of the dungeon, which is good. Moving on to Theater of Pain, a couple of changes here. First, the first boss room, there was an issue with clipping into the kind of the opening in the floor that would open up once you kill the first boss, or you're coming up from the, I guess, 4th boss once you're going up to Mordretha. So that's a good change because you want to be able to see the mechanics on the ground so you don't kill each other. So the first boss, they basically did 2 fairly big changes. They reduced the size of the Noxious Spore's growth potential. So the area denial that it puts into the fight, this is really healthy, I think, for the start as well as later in the fight, depending on who you want to actually defeat. And then they also reduced Sathel's Searing Death damage by 15%. This was good because what was happening was that the first slam would come out from Decia, which would do a lot of upfront damage. Searing Death would come out at some point later in the fight, but then it would be followed by a slam. So the Searing Death tick damage from Sathel's mechanic plus the Decia slam was becoming like really one-shotty and lethal. So Searing Death is supposed to be more of a damage over time effect than it is supposed to be like upfront damage, but when it was ticking that high, it felt more upfront. So this is a good change. I think this boss is actually starting to look kind of good. And then Koltharok, one note of change that they didn't say here is that they added a door. Basically, you have to be in the boss arena. What people were doing first week is they were just standing outside of the room behind the death spiral orbs, and they were just like turreting down the boss. Now you have to be in the room, so you have a lot less room to work with. But in order to compensate for that, they have made Well of Darkness, which are the circles around players, only target 2 players instead of 3. And they've reduced the size of those circles as well. And they've reduced the add health that you spawn. So these are all good changes. I think Koltharok is feeling like a really good fight. My only gripe right now is that the Spell Reflect for the boss frontal is really hard. For some reason, it just doesn't land. Despite using Spell Reflect every single time, sometimes it hits every single time. Sometimes it'll only hit like 1 or 2 of the times out of all the casts. So that's my only gripe with this boss right now, is that there's an inconsistency with the tank frontal. But outside of that, all of these changes are really good. Operation Floodgate, very minor changes. They made the cast a little bit easier to stop on Big Mama, on the first boss. Basically, boss that spawns these drones, and they kind of do a bunch of little mechanics. They like charge forward, and they shoot random players. But then they do this cast, and sometimes what they do is they charge out, and then start this cast right away, and you're not in melee range. So now you have a little bit more time to react to that. Instead of it being a 2-second cast, it's now 3 seconds. Good change. And then lastly, the second boss, Bront. He is the man who charges around, and you need to clear the mines using his charge. They've reduced the width against players. I'm assuming it's still going to be able to knock the bombs up at an appropriate width, because that width felt fine. But what would happen is if you were kind of a little too close, you would get stunned constantly on this fight and take damage from it. So this is hopefully a little better. Anyways, those are all the changes going into this week. I'm going to do a couple opinionated videos in the near future about the dungeons, specifically boss design, tank balancing, and yeah, the whole 9 yards. But for now, I'm going to leave you guys with this. Let me know what you guys think down below. And of course, I hope you're all staying happy, healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Peace.